Chapter 35 of The Convict by G.P.R. James. Chapter 35. There is a strange and curious difference between the light of morning and the light of evening. The same sun gives it, the same flood of glory falls through the skies, the same scene lies below, the same horizon sweeps around. It seems only that the light giver is at the one hour in the east, at the other in the west, and no sufficient cause appears for that extraordinary difference of hue in the air and over the earth. It was morning, and the soft early light was stealing gently over everything, amongst the leaves of the trees, through the breaks in the rocks, down into the deep basin of the hills, into the caverns of the lava, along the smooth unruffled surface of the lake. And Charles Dudley and Edgar Adelon were seated together upon the top of the bold crags which towered over the crater of the extinct volcano. The whole scene was softened to their eyes. A slight mist hung over the woody world on the one hand, and profound shadows, only broken here and there by the quiet morning ray, lay in the deep abyss upon the other side. It was a fit scene for such conversation as they were to hold, and Dudley, with his head resting on his hands, listened with eager attention to his young companion's words, sometimes, indeed, interrupting him by a question, but generally too intensely moved for any inquiry. "Then she loves me still?" "As deeply and devotedly as ever," answered Edgar; "and you have wronged her if you have doubted, Dudley." "Never, never," murmured Dudley. "But let me proceed," said Edgar Adelon. "Matters pursued this course for many months. I recovered completely from the fever. The trials of the rioters at Barhampton took place, and almost every man who underwent the ordeal was condemned. Men thought the government very lenient in not pressing a more serious crime upon them, and banishment for life was judged a mild sentence. I heard nothing of Mr. Clive or Helen, and you can imagine, Dudley, how my too eager and impatient spirit could bear such suspense. I inquired of Filmer, I asked everybody connected with the farm, but I received no intelligence. The priest assured me that he was acting on Mr. Clive's behalf without any authority or directions than those which he had received on that fateful night which brought so much misery along with it. Yet Helen had promised to write, and I never knew her to break her word. My father, though long detained in London, returned at length to Brandon. It was after the trial of the rioters," he added, with a sad but meaning look, "and finding poor Eda in the melancholy and desponding state which I have described, he took her into Yorkshire, in order, if possible, to divert her mind from the subject on which her thoughts rested so painfully. It was clear, however, to my eyes at least, that he himself was neither well nor happy. I guessed the cause, but that is a part of the story, Dudley, which I cannot enter into. You may, perhaps, divine the whole, but I cannot speak of it. I took advantage of the change of our residence from Brandon, and obtained my father's consent to travel for some months on the Continent. He had no idea, it is true, why I went, or what I sought; but a suspicion had crossed my mind, which, as it proved, was a just one. What made it enter into my head I cannot rightly tell. There are some things so like intuition that I can hardly doubt that the mind has greater powers than philosophers have been inclined to admit. In this instance a perception of the truth flashed across me like a stream of lightning, one day, while I was conversing with Filmer. He said nothing, it is true, which could naturally give rise to the idea which presented itself. The words were merely, "Poor Clive's long absence," and whether it was the tone in which he spoke, or the peculiar look with which the words were accompanied, I know not, but I asked myself at once, "Is Clive's absence connected with Dudley's fate?" "But tell me, Edgar," said Mr. Dudley, "did you ever suspect that Mr. Filmer himself had laboured to deprive me of the proofs of my innocence?" "Never," answered Edgar. "Eda suspected him, I know, but I always thought she was prejudiced. I also suspected him, but not of that. I thought he had practised on me one of his pious frauds." "Mr. Norries told me," said Dudley, that he had certainly taken means to stop your communication with the only men who were likely to have the power of proving that I had quitted Lord Hadley at the exact spot where I asserted I had left him, and walked on at once towards Barhampton." "He did do so," replied Edgar, "and I discovered that he did. But you must recollect I had been severely injured by a blow on the head, and I attributed Filmer's conduct to an anxiety on his part to prevent my exerting myself at a time when I was certainly unfit for it. I was angry that he did so, and I taxed him with it. He boldly justified his conduct, asked me if even the exertion I had made had not nearly killed me, and then demanded what would the consequences have been had I made such exertion 2 days before. This satisfied me, Dudley, and never till that moment which I have just been speaking of did a suspicion of the truth cross my mind. However, if I had been anxious before to discover Clive's residence, I was now determined that I would do so, and as soon as possible I set out upon the pursuit. One of the men who had been tried for insurrection acknowledged that they had been supplied with arms from France, brought over in a vessel chartered by the communists of that country at the port of Nantes. I knew it was the same in which Mr. Clive and Helen had quitted England, and to Nantes I accordingly went. I had obtained every clue that I possibly could as to the proprietors of the vessel before I set out, but my information aided me but little. No effort I could make enabled me to trace those whom I sought. I wandered all through Brittany, and La Vendée, and Normandy, and Touraine, but it was all in vain. Beyond the town of Nantes itself I lost all trace, and at length, late in the spring of last year, I returned to England. My father and Eda were by this time in London, and Filmer, I found, was absent in France. I told Eda all I had done. I tried to console her with hopes of still establishing your innocence. It was the only consolation the dear girl had; for my father, not judging rightly of her heart and mind, was eager to dissipate her gloomy thoughts by forcing her into society. His house was filled with people from morning to night, but Eda remained almost entirely shut up in her own room, and would not go out to any public place, or any party. She never would believe that Filmer had been really anxious for your safety, and her doubts now affected me. A new suspicion took hold of me. Although he had made a pretence to my father of very different business in France, I suspected that he had gone to see Clive; and one day, when my father handed me over a letter of his, containing some interesting observations upon the state of France, there is no man more capable of making them, I examined carefully the postmark of the letter, and discovered the word Angers. In looking at the date of the letter, it was Tours. This was a discovery. He was deceiving my father as well as myself. But I brought no rash charges. I have grown wonderfully prudent, Dudley, and I would not even write to Clive till I was aware that Filmer had left him, if, as I suspected, he was at Angers with him. Another month passed in impatient suspense, and my father threw out many hints of tours in different parts of Europe, which he thought might amuse Eda's mind. There were even preparations for travelling made, when suddenly Mr. Filmer again appeared amongst us. The very night after his arrival, I was informed by Sir Arthur that he intended to go to Italy, and thence by the Ionian Islands and Greece to Constantinople. Eda and Filmer were to be his companions, and my presence was looked upon as a matter of course. I was not even invited. It was taken for granted. But I was resolved not to go, at least at once, and therefore I took care to involve myself in engagements which could not easily be broken through. With one friend I laid a bet, a very heavy one, as to the result of 3 days' shooting on the moors. I promised my friend Eldred to be present at his marriage, and in fact I created for myself so many excuses that my father was obliged to own it would be necessary for me to stop and join the party afterwards at Naples. I could see Mr. Filmer's face change when he heard this arrangement, and a look of bitter gloom came upon it, which confirmed my former doubts. Without waiting for their departure, I at once wrote a letter to Clive himself, and addressed it Angers. But I was now suspicious of everything. I took it to the post office myself, and I told him to whom I wrote all that had befallen you, begging him to address his reply to a hotel in London. Day after day passed by. My father and the rest set out upon their tour, and I began to fancy that I had been mistaken, for no letter came. Then I determined that I would go over to Angers myself, and was sitting in the dining room of my father's house, the only public room which had been left open when he went abroad, gloomily pondering, both over my own fate and yours, Dudley, when I saw, on the opposite side of the street, a figure which instantly made me start up and hurry to the window. It was Clive himself, and he was gazing up at the closed windows of the house, thinking, as he told me afterwards, that there was nobody in town, and proposing to go down to Brandon in search of me. He had received my letter, and, as soon as possible, had come over in person, leaving dear Helen in France. I need not tell you now all the particulars of what followed, for we shall have plenty of time, I trust, to dwell upon details which will interest you much. It may be only necessary to say that the noble-spirited old man had been kept in utter ignorance of an act having been charged upon you, which he had himself performed, an act which in him was an act of justice, but in you might be considered as a crime. He told me that Helen had written to me often, and that although he had not seen what she wrote, he was sure that she had used such expressions as would have led me at once to perceive how Lord Hadley had met his death. "How was it?" exclaimed Dudley, interrupting him. "But I can guess. Go on, Edgar." "Nay, it is soon told," answered Edgar Adelon. On that fateful night, Clive had learned from Mr. Norris the shameful persecution which my sweet Helen had suffered from Lord Hadley, and he was returning over the hills, with a heart full of angry feelings, when he heard a cry for help, and instantly recognised his daughter's voice. Springing forward, he found the villain dragging her down towards the sea-shore, where he expected, it seems, to meet with a boat, which would have carried them to France. Clive instantly struck him a furious blow. Lord Hadley let go Helen, and returned it, and another was given by Clive. Only those 3 blows were struck, but the third, coming from Mr. Clive's powerful arm, dashed the unfortunate wretch back upon the railings at the top of the cliff. The woodwork gave way, and he fell headlong to the bottom. Thus took place the death of Lord Hadley, and you have seen enough of Mr. Clive yourself to be sure that it was not with his consent or knowledge that the deed was imputed to you. As soon as he discovered from my letter that such was the case, he came to give himself up, and to clear you, and as he knew little of the means to be employed in such cases, he at first sought me at the hotel where I had ordered the letters to be addressed, and was thence directed to my father's London house. More by accident than by possessing any better information than his own, I advised him to follow what, as it proved, was the best course he could have taken. I felt sure that, under the circumstances, no evil result could befall him from the open confession of the whole, which he proposed to make, and I offered to go with him immediately to the Secretary of State, whom I know personally, and tell him the whole facts. He agreed perfectly to my views, and we set off at once. You know Clive's straightforward, almost abrupt way of dealing, but in this instance it was understood and appreciated. The secretary asked but few questions. Clive placed before him the letter which he had received from me, and told him that it was the first intelligence which had been given to him of an innocent man having been accused and condemned for a deed which he had performed, and that he had instantly come over from France to tell the whole truth. The tale was so simple, and Clive's sincerity so clear, that all doubts as to your share in the transaction were at an end. The only question was how the case of Clive himself was to be dealt with, and the secretary determined to leave him at liberty till his daughter and a labourer at the Grange, named Daniel Connor, could be brought to London, upon his undertaking to appear whenever he should be called upon, and to hold no communication in the meantime with either of the 2 who were summoned as witnesses. In the end, a full investigation took place at the Secretary of State's office, where a police magistrate of great keenness and discrimination was called upon to assist. The examinations of Helen and of Daniel Connor were conducted apart, without either of them having seen Mr. Clive. Helen told the story simply and exactly as her father had told it, and the man, after a momentary hesitation and some prevarication, on being informed that Clive had come over himself voluntarily to tell the whole tale, confirmed every particular which had been previously stated. His evidence was compared with that which had been given before the coroner's jury and at your trial, and it was found that, although he had evidently given a colour to the truth on those two occasions, which left the jury to infer that you had committed the deed, he had not actually perjured himself. The intention, however, to procure your condemnation was so clear that it led to further inquiry, for in every other respect the man seemed honest and well-meaning, and the character that he bore in the country was exceedingly high. His veneration and regard for Clive did not sufficiently account for his conduct, and on being severely cross-questioned, he admitted that he had been prompted to give his evidence in the manner which you heard it given. I am sorry to say that the prompter was one whose character and profession should have been the last to be sullied by such acts." "I can guess who you mean," replied Dudley. "But here comes Norries himself, and I should much wish to ask him one question upon this matter, namely, why he did not himself either tell you that Clive had done the deed when you were seeking for evidence in my defence, or give Mr. Clive information of my having been tried and condemned, though innocent." While he was speaking, Norries came up and sat down beside them, and as he did not answer, although he must have heard part of what passed, Dudley addressed the question to himself. He replied with a smile, "How ready all men are, Mr. Dudley, to judge upon insufficient grounds. You have jumped at the conclusion that I was aware of facts which had not in any way come to my cognizance. I will not deny that I felt the strongest possible suspicion that my brother-in-law Clive had killed Lord Hadley, knowing the vehemence of his nature, the warmth and tenderness of his love for his daughter, and the gross insults and injuries she had received. But I had no right to inform others of my suspicions, and as to where Clive was, I never heard till yesterday. I was sure, however, that wherever he was, he would sooner or later do you justice. Indeed, I do not know, and cannot comprehend, how the most upright and honest man that ever lived could suffer, either by his act or neglect, another to bear the imputation of a deed of his." "He was deceived," answered Edgar Adelon. "He was kept without information. He was made to believe that suspicion rested upon him, and that if he returned to England he would bring a blight and a shadow upon his honourable name, and a disgrace upon his child. He knew not that Dudley had ever been tried, far less that he had been condemned, and it is evident that Helen's letters to myself were all intercepted and destroyed." "By whom?" demanded Norries. "By the priest," replied Edgar. "Ay, I remember," said Norries thoughtfully. "There was a priest used to come down to the house, one Father Peter they used to call him. I never saw him, but Clive represented him as upright and elevated in character and mind." "He knows better now," answered Edgar, "for many of Mr. Filmer's insincere proceedings have been now so thoroughly exposed that the blackest web of subtlety ever woven by the disciples of Loyola cannot conceal their falsehood and their baseness." "Filmer!" said Norries thoughtfully. "Is that the same man whom they call Father Peter?" "The same," replied Edgar. "But to return to my tale, Dudley. Clive's straightforward tale, and Helen's clear and candid evidence, backed by that of many of the servants at Clive Grange, who were more or less aware of Lord Hadley's previous conduct towards her, convinced the Secretary of State that there was no ground for the Crown proceeding against a man who had accidentally slain another in defence of his own child. He left it to the relations of the dead man to act as they liked, but upon a clear view of the evidence they were advised not to prosecute, and thus ended the matter as affecting Clive. In regard to yourself, a full pardon immediately passed the Great Seal, and I have the strongest and most positive assurance in writing that everything shall be done, as soon as you return, to clear your reputation from the slightest stain. I felt, Dudley," continued Edgar, grasping his hand, "that your sympathy with me, and your indignation of the base treatment of one I love, had had a share, at least, in bringing so many misfortunes upon you; and I determined at once to set out to seek you, and bear you the happy tidings of your exculpation in person. Although Helen might feel some anxiety for my safety and health during a long voyage, and, perhaps, would have been better pleased, as far as she was personally concerned, had I remained in England, she was far from trying to dissuade me, and after seeing her and her father once more happily established at Clive Grange, I set out for this distant land as soon as I could find a ship. Shortly before I departed, I received a letter from my father, who had journeyed as far as Syria. He expressed some surprise that I had not joined him and Eda, but doubtless," added the young man, with a smile, "he was more surprised still when my next letter informed him that I had sailed for Australia. I gave him no particulars, nor assigned any reason for my going; for I wished much, Dudley, to leave you free to act in any way you might think fit, and to consult with you upon my own future conduct as well as yours. There is no probability of the tidings of Clive's confession and your exculpation reaching my father from any public source, as the examination was conducted privately, and I made it a particular request, both to Helen and her father, that they would not speak of the subject at all till my return. I will not conceal from you that there are difficulties and dangers, perhaps, before us both, prejudices of many kinds to be overcome, ay, and the skill and cunning of a subtle adversary to be frustrated. I know him now, and depend upon it, he will never forgive the detection of his falsehood and baseness." "Filmer," said Norries, who had been meditating gravely for several minutes, "Filmer, Father Peter, that throws fresh light upon the whole. Mr. Dudley, I should like to speak with you for a few moments, quite alone, and afterwards we had better go to breakfast, for this mountain air gives a keen appetite." "I must catch or shoot our breakfast first," replied Dudley, "unless you will content yourselves with some salt provisions, which I have laid up here." "Let us walk down to the lake together," replied Norries. "We can converse as we go, and you can exercise your skill in angling, while I give you some information that may be useful." Dudley willingly agreed, and when he and Norries rejoined the party above, after an absence of more than an hour, they brought with them plenty of fish, and Dudley's face bore an expression of thoughtful satisfaction, as if his conversation with Norries had added a new relief to that which the intelligence of Edgar had afforded. CHAPTER 36 of the Convict, by G.P.R. James. Chapter 36. Eda Brandon sat in her room alone. Her fair face was somewhat paler than when first it was presented to the reader's eyes, and the look of sparkling cheerfulness was no longer there. It had grown very thoughtful, but yet those who had seen her only 4 days before, if they had keen and remarking eyes, would have perceived, when they looked at her now, that, from some cause, a great alteration had very recently taken place, that an expression of careless despondency was gone, that there was, in fact, the light of hope renewed upon her countenance. During the long pilgrimage she had made with her uncle, it must not be supposed that Eda had cherished the melancholy which had fallen upon her, that she had neglected any reasonable opportunity of diverting her thoughts from the bitter subject of a hopeless passion. All that was beautiful in nature, all that was fine and admirable in art, all that was rich in association or decorated by memories, she eagerly sought and calmly dwelt upon, feeling that they were objects which might well give the mind occupation, without altogether jarring with the sadder tones which rose continually from the heart. It was only society that she avoided, the society of the world, which, in reality and truth, is not society at all; for the mere herding together of a certain number of human beings, with hardly a thought or feeling in common, deserves a very different name. There might be, also, a certain portion of apprehension in her thus flying from the mixed crowd. She had a sort of presentiment that her uncle would seek to force some match upon her, in the idle expectation of weaning her heart from a passion which, although it had not lately been mentioned between them, she felt convinced he must see traces of each day. And as at every instant she felt that her love for Dudley could never decay, as she longed to be with him more and more, she was anxious to avoid anything which could bring on discussions equally painful to herself and to Sir Arthur. Thus their journey had passed in visiting many distant scenes, and, so far as this could afford amusement, Eda had gained something by the continual change. But whenever they stopped, the same dark gloom fell upon her, and it became the more profound when, at the end of a tour even longer than had been at first proposed, they returned to take up their residence at Brandon. Sir Arthur, with the pertinacity which characterized him, and the somewhat impenetrable blindness to the character of others, which is universal, I believe, in vain and self-sufficient men, still pursued his purposes with regard to Eda, and thinking that the opportunities of a country residence would be most favourable to his schemes, filled the house with gentlemen, each of whom, he thought, might be a suitable match for his fair niece, and who were not at all indifferent to the advantages of wedding broad lands and well-economized revenues. There was a middle-aged peer, and a young and wealthy baronet, and a simple esquire, enormously rich in everything but brains, and a captain of dragoons, the nephew and presumptive heir to a duke, who, to say the truth, was the best of the party, for he was a man of feeling, of character, and of thought, a little enthusiastic, indeed, in his notions, but whose imagination, in all its flights, soared heavenward. He was the only one who even caught Eda's ear for more than a moment, and he did so under somewhat curious circumstances, for it was neither his abilities, the richness of his fancy, nor the generous character of his mind, sparkling through his conversation, which attracted her attention. On the contrary, as she saw from the first that he sought her society rather eagerly, she was for a time inclined to withdraw from him more decidedly than from the others, when one day, shortly after his arrival, he said, almost abruptly, "Miss Brandon, you are very sad, and I can see that all these people tease you. I can divine the cause, but do not class me with them, for if you suppose that I have come here with the same views and purposes, you are mistaken." "I do not exactly understand you," said Eda, gravely, "nor can I admit exactly that my uncle's friends do tease me. I am not fond of much society, but that is all." "There is one way of explaining what I mean, Miss Brandon," answered the other, "which will make you understand me without referring to other men's views. It is by making you a confidant of that which is indeed a great secret. I am engaged to a lady whom I love most sincerely, and have indeed been engaged for more than 2 years. She is not rich, and I am very poor, and we say nothing about our mutual understanding, for fear it should give offence to those with whom my hopes of fortune rest. I have told you this because I think it will put your mind at ease, so far as I am concerned, and because I wish much to speak with you upon another subject, of much interest, which may occupy more time than we can now command alone. There, I knew how it would be. Here comes Lord Kingsland to say his soft nothings." "Which I certainly shall not wait to hear," replied Eda, with a smile. This brief conversation had taken place the day before, and now Eda sat with an open letter before her, in the handwriting of her cousin Edgar. It was light and cheerful, though not very definite, and there were 2 or 3 words in it which conveyed to Eda's mind more than the general tone seemed to imply. All he said was, "Do not give way to melancholy, my sweet cousin. Shake off the gloom which hung upon you when you departed, for the melancholy is now without cause, and the gloom is very useless. Storm clouds last but a day or 2, Eda. The wind is up, and has wafted yours away." Eda knew what Edgar would not so have written to her had he not had better hopes in store than he ventured to express, and although she had shared her uncle's surprise when she first heard that Edgar had gone to Australia, she had felt what Sir Arthur had not felt, that he had not taken that journey without a powerful motive. It was the spring of the year, the days had not lengthened much, and it was still dark at the dinner hour. Eda had dined in her own room the day before, but now she prepared to go down with a lighter heart than she had known for long, long months, and ringing for her maid, conversed with her from time to time, while she dressed her hair. When the girl's task was done, she went down to the housekeeper's room, not without having remarked the change in her mistress, and there she told her good old fellow servant, with a shrewd and self-satisfied look, "Miss Brandon's getting over it, I can tell you, Mrs. Gregson. The captain's to be the man, I'm sure." In the meantime, Eda proceeded to the drawing-room with a lightened heart, and diversified the ceremonious moments which occur while people are waiting for their meal, by damping, if not extinguishing, any hopes Sir Arthur's guests might have conceived. "Really, you look resplendent to-night, Miss Brandon," said the peer, seating himself beside her. "The country air seems quite to have refreshed you." "I trust it may have the same effect upon your lordship in time," replied Eda, and a slight smile that came upon the lips of the young dragoon gave more point than she intended to her words. Lord Kingsland, however, was not so easily driven from his attack, and he replied, "Oh, I do not think country air has any effect upon me. I am so much accustomed to spend the whole spring in London, that the air of the great city at that season of the year agrees with me by habit better than that of the country." "I feel very differently about it," replied Eda. "I should have thought, from my own experience, that 50 or 60 springs in London would shrivel any one to a mere mummy." "Miss Brandon, Miss Brandon!" exclaimed the peer with a smile, which he intended to be perfectly courteous and good–humoured, but from which he could not banish an expression of mortification. "I see the air must be detrimental to one's looks, at all events, or you would not pile so many years upon my head." Eda would fain have apologized and explained, but Lord Kingsland had enjoyed enough of her conversation for that evening, and he soon after walked away. The man of money next approached, dressed in the very height of the fashion, and began speaking of the beauty and fertility of some parts of the estate of Brandon, remarking how wide a space it occupied in the map which hung in the wall. "It is indeed of a goodly length and breadth," replied Eda, "almost too extensive to be held by one individual. I am sufficient of a politician to think it would be much better if large properties were prevented from increasing. Moderate fortunes in the hands of many must be better for a country than immense fortunes in the hands of a few." "Very Spartan notions, indeed," said the young gentleman; "but I dare say you would not carry them out in practice." "Undoubtedly," replied Eda, gaily. "I would prevent any man, having a large estate, from acquiring another by any means." There was no reply to this bold assertion, and the baronet who followed seemed likely to call upon himself some as decided an expression of opinion, when dinner was announced, and the peer exercised his prerogative of taking Miss Brandon into the dining–room. The meal passed off tranquilly and stupidly enough, and the pudding and tart course were being removed, when a dull, heavy sound, like that of a cannon, made the windows rattle in the sashes. Nobody took any notice, however, for Mr. Filmer was describing, with powerful eloquence, one of the ceremonies of the Romish church, the performance of which he and Sir Arthur had witnessed at St. Peter's. At the interval of about a minute, however, the same sound was repeated, and after another interval the report was heard again. "Those are minute–guns," said Sir Arthur Adelon. "Some ship got upon the Dog–bank, I dare say, and the wind is blowing very high, too." "I saw a very fine large bark just coming round the point," said Lord Kingsland, "while I was taking a stroll upon the Downs this evening. Probably it is her guns we hear, for there was no other vessel in sight." "She must have passed the Dog, then, far," said Mr. Filmer, "and has probably run upon the spit beyond Beech Rock. The wind sets thence, so that we should hear the guns as clearly as we do now." "More likely she has gone bump upon the shore," said Sir Arthur, "or the low reefs which lie 200 or 300 yards out. She would try to hug the land as close as possible, to get into the bay and avoid the fury of the gale." While these words were spoken on all parts, several more guns were distinctly heard, and Eda, rising, with her face very pale, as the first dishes of the dessert were being set upon the table, retired, saying, "I will send some of the servants, my dear uncle. They may, perhaps, give the fishermen some help in case of need." "They will never arrive in time, my love," replied Sir Arthur, "if the ship has gone ashore. It must be fully 12 miles up to the spit, or more. But do as you like." "I will certainly send, if you have no objection," replied Eda. "The men may aid to save a human life, and a walk or ride of 12 miles is nothing in comparison." Retiring to the drawing room, Eda immediately rang the bell, and ordered as many of the servants as could be spared to get upon horseback and ride on as fast as possible in the direction from which the sound of the guns seemed to proceed. Her orders were clear, calm, and distinct, although her pale face and her trembling hand seemed to show that she was greatly agitated. "Call all the country people as you go," she said, "and tell them to hurry down to give assistance with whatever their experience of the coast may lead them to think is necessary. I know," she continued, "that the salvation of human life is not rewarded by the law or by government, while enormous rewards follow the saving of property, but tell the men that I will give 10 guineas for every life that is saved by their exertions." "10 guineas, ma'am?" said the butler to whom she spoke. "That is a great deal." "10 guineas or more," replied Eda in a firm tone, "if it be necessary to quicken their efforts. Now make haste." And lifting her eyes to the door, she perceived that the young captain of dragoons was standing just upon the nearer side of the threshold. She coloured a little as she saw him, for real enthusiasts have generally a certain degree of shyness with them; but as soon as she had ceased speaking, the officer advanced, saying, "I will go with the men, Miss Brandon. They need somebody to lead and to direct, and I am not unaccustomed to such transactions. Hark! the guns seem to have ceased, but that is no sign that the poor souls are out of danger, and I will set out directly." "I will not thank you, Captain M ," said Eda Brandon, "for I have no personal interest in these poor people; but your own heart will thank you, and God will bless you for your readiness on this occasion." He left her and departed, and Eda sat in solitude, with her head resting on her hand, for nearly half an hour, with feelings which it would be very difficult to describe, for they were sensations for which no reasonable cause could be assigned, phantom fears which seemed to rise out of the depth of night, unevoked by anything more tangible than themselves. At length she was joined by the rest of the party, and strove to maintain a tranquil and equal demeanour, although the utter indifference she saw around her to the fate of a number of human beings perishing, perhaps within a few miles, rather tended to increase than to diminish the agitation which she felt. Mr. Filmer sat down to play at chess with the younger baronet, and beat him most signally, giving him a piece. Sir Arthur and Lord Kingsland played at piquet, and she was left to the tender mercies of the rich young commoner, who entertained her with an account of graperies and pine pits, gave her a lecture upon the horticultural gardens, and was even deviating into some account of stock and piggeries, when Eda herself turned the conversation. 11 o'clock arrived, and nobody appeared, but Eda made no movement to go. The chessmen were by this time discarded, 3 games of piquet had been played, and Sir Arthur had rung for wine and water, when Captain M entered with a calm and easy air, and walking up at once to Eda, without taking the least notice of any one else, he said, in a low tone, "There is some one in the library who will be glad to see you, and whom you will be glad to see. Do not agitate yourself," he continued, seeing that she trembled very much. "All is safe." But before I proceed to relate what followed, I must notice the events which had taken place between the time at which Captain M set out on his expedition and that at which he returned. Chapter 37 of The Convict, by G.P.R. James. Chapter 37. The night was very dark, and blowing a gale of wind. The blast was not, indeed, directly upon the shore at the point of the coast nearest to Brandon, but about 7 miles to the eastward. the line of the land took a bend towards the south, forming a low shingly beach, with a spit of sand running out into the sea, for full half a mile beyond the southernmost point of the cliffs, and against this shingly beach the gale blew hard and direct. The distance from Brandon House to the sea in a straight line was less than 2 miles, but Captain M, followed by 5 or 6 servants, took his way across the country towards that part of the coast on which he judged the ship must have stranded. Riding on rapidly, he arrived, in about 3/4 of an hour, at a village some 9 miles from Brandon, and calling at 1 or 2 of the houses, he found that all the men, warned by the signals of distress, had gone down to the shore to give assistance. He learned, too, some farther particulars of the disaster which had occurred, and the exact spot where it had taken place. Pushing on without farther pause, then, he rode through the little village, where, as may be remembered, Edgar Adelon obtained his first interview with Martin Oldkirk, and issuing forth at the farther end, he soon after came upon the sea-shore, where a lighted tar-barrel and several links shed a red glare over a terrible scene, which was also, from time to time, partially illuminated by glimpses of the moon, as the grey clouds, hurrying rapidly past, left her bright face visible for a moment, and then concealed it again beneath their swarthy veil. A tall and beautiful vessel appeared aground at the distance of less than 100 yards from the beach. The masts were all still standing, and the fine tracery of the rigging, partially seen by the lights upon the shore, was now and then rendered completely visible, when the moonlight broke forth behind for a moment, and brightened the stormy sky. Around the burning tar-barrel were several groups of men, with some women and children, and farther down upon the beach, even amidst the spray and foam, were others, one of whom held up a link, half extinguished by the dashing waves. An awful surf was falling in thunder upon the shore, and each mountain wave, as it rolled up, struck the unfortunate vessel on the stern and windward side, making a clear breach over her as she heeled towards the beach. When the moon was hidden, only the bow and the foremast could be seen by the lights on the shore, the rest of the ship being enveloped in darkness, except where the white surf rushed pouring over the hull, and sprang glittering up amongst the cordage. But when the momentary moon shone out, the shrouds, the tops, and many parts of the rigging were seen loaded with human beings, striving in agony to postpone the fate which seemed ready to fall upon them. There were shrieks and cries for help, and loud shouts of direction and command, but all were so mingled with the noise of the rushing wind and the thunder of the billows upon the shore, that everything was indistinct, rising in one loud screaming roar to the spot at which the young officer had arrived. Drawing in his horse, he paused to gaze for a moment, and consider what was expedient to be done, and at the same moment he perceived some of the men, with that gallant and intrepid daring which characterises the boatmen on the English coast, endeavouring to launch a boat a little to windward of the stranded ship. With a loud cheer they pushed her down into the water as a wave receded, and with a tremendous effort were shoving her off, when again the billows returned with a furious sweep, capsized her in a moment, and nothing was seen for several seconds but the figures of the men struggling in the surf, and the black hull of the boat surrounded by the whirling eddies of the retiring wave. For a moment it seemed as if several of the gallant fellows would be lost, but some clung to the boat, others scrambled back to the shore, and one who was carried out, striking hard for life, was caught by another wave, and dashed back again, bleeding and almost senseless, on the beach. Springing to the ground with several of the servants, Captain M hurried down to the principal group upon the beach, and put 1 or 2 questions, the import of which not being clearly seen at first by the men he addressed, they answered somewhat sullenly. "My good sir," he said, speaking to a large square-built man of the middle age, who seemed to be one of the principal boatmen, "I have been accustomed to these things, and aided to save many lives on a worse coast than this. The same means may prove effectual here, but we must have recourse to them immediately, or the ship will be a complete wreck." "In 2 hours there won't be one of her timbers together," answered the man, dully. "Then the more need to get the people off her at once," said Captain M. "Ay, if you can do it," said the boatman, turning away. "Stay a moment," cried the young officer, in a tone of command. "Has any one got a gun with a large bore, and a good long hank of stout but thin cord?" The object seemed to strike the man instantly, and turning sharply round, he laid his broad hand upon the young officer's shoulder, exclaiming with an oath, "That's a good thought. There's my large duck gun will do capitally. And as for a cord, you can't have anything better than one of our fish lines. It's both light and strong." All was changed in a moment. The efforts of the crowd were turned in a different direction. Hope seemed to revive. A number of fishing lines were brought forth. The heavy gun was placed in Captain M.'s hands. Powder was procured. A bullet pierced and attached to one end of the strong cord, while the other end was fastened tightly to a thick rope. Every one aided, and Captain M., having charged the piece, advanced as far as he could down the beach, so that the waves, as they flowed up, reached his knees, and then prepared to fire. Before he did so, however, he turned to those behind him, saying, "We shall have to try several times before we succeed, so do not be disappointed if the first shot fails." Then, elevating the gun, he pulled the trigger, in the hope that the bullet would carry the line over the rigging of the ship. As he had foreseen, however, the first attempt was unsuccessful. The sudden explosion of the powder broke the line before the bullet had got a foot from the mouth of the gun. "We must have less powder and a smaller ball," said the young officer. "Some one cut a piece out of my glove here to wrap it in. Perhaps we shall succeed better this time." Nor was he disappointed. The ball carried the line clear over the ship between the main and foremasts, and fell into the sea some way beyond. The unhappy voyagers seemed to have comprehended the efforts made for their safety, and had watched with eager eyes and in profound silence everything that was done. Not a word, not a cry was uttered from the moment the first shot was fired, and even when the second and more successful attempt was made, they were all silent, for the line was so fine they did not perceive that the efforts of their friends on shore had been successful till the gestures of the crowd, rather than the voice of one of the boatmen, speaking through a trumpet, drew the attention of a sailor to the spot where the line had fallen. The directions were then given to run it through a pulley, and gently haul up the rope, and this being accomplished, the rope was made fast at both ends, and a means of communication, however frail, established with the shore. A shout of joy burst forth from the people of the ship, and a loud cheer answered it from the beach. There were many difficulties still to be overcome, however, for as the ship rocked to and fro when the waves struck her, there was a great chance of the rope snapping, especially if burdened with the weight of a man. But the son of one of the boatmen, a lad of about 13 years of age, volunteered to try the dangerous path with a light hawser made fast round his middle. Slowly and with difficulty he pursued his way, holding on both by hands and feet. But his perilous task was at length accomplished, and as soon as the hawser was firmly fixed, he returned to the shore, bringing back the end of the rope first sent, which had been passed through a pulley, so as to play easily. Several of the men then came over from the ship without much difficulty, but this method was so slow that Captain M proposed another plan, which was immediately adopted when it was found that there were a number of women and children in the bark. One of the sails of a small lugger was detached from the yard, and the corners being gathered together and made quite secure, it was slung upon the hawser and connected with the rope passed through the pulley. It was thus easily moved backwards and forwards between the ship and the shore. 2 and sometimes 3 people were brought to land at once, and joy and satisfaction displayed itself in every form and shape amongst those who were rescued from the grave. During the whole time that these operations had been proceeding, 2 men were seen standing together in the foretop, who, though they had busied themselves and desisted greatly in fastening the hawser and in passing the ropes, showed no anxiety to save themselves, aiding, indeed, to put the women and children into the sail, but remaining perfectly calm and motionless while the others passed to the shore. There was something in their manner and appearance which struck Captain M not a little, and advancing to one of the persons who had first come over, he inquired who those 2 persons were. "They are passengers from Sydney, sir," replied the man. Perfect gentlemen, both of them, and two brave fellows as ever lived, for if it had not been for them we should have all lost heart long ago." While he was speaking, some of the men who remained on board seemed by their gestures to urge the two gentlemen to go over, and the shorter of the two, taking a child in his arms from one of the sailors, it was the only child left, stepped into the sail, and holding fast by the rope above, was speedily drawn to land. A woman who had been brought across some time before with two other children, now rushed almost down into the sea when this new freight approached, as if afraid the man would drop the child. But the young gentleman, for he seemed very young, and was evidently of a superior class, placed the little boy safely in her arms, saying, "He is quite safe and warm." The mother prayed God to bless him, but at the same moment his hand was taken by Captain M and shaken heartily, while one of the servants exclaimed, "Mr. Adelon! Hooray! Hooray!" and half the people on the beach took up the cry, and waved their hats joyfully. But Captain M and Edgar Adelon were speaking together eagerly and in a low voice, while the latter pointed once or twice to the foretop of the stranded vessel, as if explaining to his friend that some one whom they both knew was there. Several other persons then landed, so that the number on the shore amounted to nearly 60, besides the inhabitants of the neighbouring huts and villages. Amongst the last who appeared was Edward Dudley, and he was warmly greeted by Captain M, though his appearance now, it must be remarked, notwithstanding his being somewhat worn and tempest-tossed, was very different from that of the nameless fisherman by the nameless lake. The servants of Sir Arthur Adelon were standing at some distance while their young master spoke with Captain M, and Dudley, taking the arm of the latter, walked slowly away with him up the beach, and out of the light of the fire. But Edgar turned to speak a few minutes to his fellow travellers, giving kind and liberal orders for their comfort and accommodation. "I do not wish," said Dudley, addressing Captain M, "to be recognised just at present. I will choose my own time and my own manner, and you may, doubtless, divine the reasons, as I know you have been made acquainted with a considerable portion of my history." "I can easily conceive," replied Captain M, "that you have a great many painful and unpleasant things to go through, which you would desire to do in your own way. But I congratulate you most sincerely, Mr. Dudley, not alone upon your salvation this night, but upon your restoration to your country and your friends, your property and your reputation. I trust this storm will be the last you will have to encounter." "God only knows," replied Dudley; "but for the future, my dear sir, I shall be less apt than in earlier years to give way either to hope or to despair." "Hope is the best of the two," replied the young officer in a lighter tone. "It comes from heaven, and is an ingredient, more or less, in everything that is good, and high, and holy. The other comes from below, leading to all that is evil, and dark, and disastrous. Choose hope, then, my good friend. But here comes some one quickly after us. I trust none of the men are much injured." "None of the survivors," answered Dudley, gravely; "but 20 or 30 perished when the ship first struck." "Mr. Adelon sent me, sir," said a rough but not unpleasant voice, "to show one of you two gentlemen the way to my cottage. It is the gentleman who was on the wreck," he continued, looking at Dudley, who said, in reply, that he was willing to go wherever the other should lead. "Then I will leave you now," said Captain M in a low voice, "and your secret is perfectly safe with me, depend upon it. But I trust that we shall meet again before I depart for London, and if not here, in the great city." "I will certainly find you out," replied Dudley, "for the scene and the circumstances in which we first met are never to be obliterated from memory, nor the kindness with which you soothed and relieved at a moment when I thought there was none to help." Then they parted, and after taking a few steps forward with the stout, broad-set countryman who had been sent up to him, Dudley inquired how far they were from Brandon. "Hard upon 11 miles, sir," replied the man. "Then the place where we run ashore must be what they call Beach Rock Spit, I suppose?" rejoined Dudley. "Just so, sir," said the man. "The rock that names it is about 2 miles farther on, t'other side of the spit, as we call it, but the village is up hard by, not above a quarter of a mile inland." "Do you know of a man of the name of Martin Oldkirk?" asked Dudley, after advancing a few paces farther. "He must live in that village, I think." "Yes, I know him," answered the countryman, abruptly. "What do you want with him?" "I want some conversation with him," answered Dudley. "I bring him some news of distant friends, and had, indeed, brought him a letter, but that, with all the rest of my baggage, is in the unfortunate ship, which will be a total wreck before to–morrow." "I'm sorry for that, sir," said his companion; "for, to tell you the truth, I am Martin Oldkirk myself, so you may speak away as fast as you please." "By and by will do," answered Dudley; "for I shall be very glad, Oldkirk, if you can let me lodge in your cottage for a night or two. At all events, you will allow me to dry my clothes there, and while that is doing, we can talk of other things." "I shall be very happy to lodge you, sir," replied the man, in a civil tone; "but Lord bless you, sir, it is not fit for such as you; and besides, there's but one bed and a bare bedstead in the place." "The bare bedstead will do well enough for me," replied Dudley, "at least for the present, and to–morrow, perhaps, you will be able to procure me something else. Doubtless to–night every house and every bed in the place will have more than its fair share of occupants." "We may be quite sure of that," answered Martin Oldkirk; "but I can get you some good hay and a clean pair of sheets, and that, with plenty of coats and things to keep you warm, will be better lodging than where you were like to have lodged an hour or two ago." "That is true," answered Dudley, "and I should be a fool to grumble. You know a certain Mr. Norris, Oldkirk, do you not?" "That I do," replied the man, with a start. "Poor gentleman, I am sorry for him. He deserved better, but he might have got worse. And one thing will always make his heart light: he never betrayed any one, though he might have got off himself if he had peached against others. But he always was an upright man, and readier to hurt himself than any one else. But I can't help thinking of him often, and how hard it is that he should be out there, working like a galley–slave, when he only wished to free his country. I daresay he's very sad–like, isn't he, sir? For I take it you have come from that place, don't you?" "Make your mind easy about his fate," answered Dudley; "for he was well and happy when I saw him, and would not, I believe, come back to England, even if they would let him. He is under no restraint either, except that he cannot return from banishment." "Ay, they will find out what a man they've lost," answered Oldkirk. "I should have liked to have seen his handwriting once again, however. But there we are, just at the cottage, and I will blow you up a fire in a minute, and then run and get some things that you may want. A glass of brandy and water wouldn't be amiss, nor against Father Mathew either, for I'm quite sure that the doctor would order it for you, after having gone through such a business." "I'm accustomed to privation in storm and tempest," answered Dudley, entering the cottage, "so do not give yourself much trouble about provisions, my good friend." But for some reason or another, Martin Oldkirk, though, as we have seen, not given at all times to very intense courtesy, was determined to do the best he could to make his guest comfortable; and having blown the smouldering embers of his fire into a blaze, and piled on a quantity of mingled coal and wood, he went out again upon his hospitable errand. Dudley took off his coat and waistcoat to dry them at the fire, and drawing a pocket–book from the pocket of the former, examined the papers which it contained carefully, to ascertain that they had not been injured by the sea–water, the spray of the waves having dashed over him for several hours. The leathern cover of the book was completely wet, but the contents were safe enough; and after seeing that some documents, apparently official, were all uninjured, he read over by a candle, which his host had lighted, some memoranda written in a clear, clerk–like hand. "Ay, if he will answer me," he said, commenting as he read; "but I doubt the fact. It is most unfortunate, the loss of my baggage. It cannot be helped, however, and after all, it is not vengeance I seek. Nevertheless, the power to thwart this man's evil schemes was something." And sitting down by the fireside, he fell into thoughts from which he was roused, in about 20 minutes, by the sudden lifting of the latch of the door, and the entrance of Edgar Adelon and Captain M. "They are all safe," said Edgar. "And now, what will you do, Dudley? I shall ride on to Brandon at once." "And I will remain here, Edgar," replied the other, "if you are quite sure that none of the servants recognise me. I remembered the butler's face at once." "I do not believe that any one saw you," replied Edgar; "and I suppose the best plan will be to act in the manner that was previously arranged; for our shipwreck here," he added with a smile, "has merely landed us 100 miles nearer Brandon." "The only thing," replied Dudley, "that is necessary is not to mention to any one my return to England, till I have time to arrange all my plans, nor indeed to say that you have met with me at all, or heard anything concerning me." "But Eda," said the young gentleman, "what to her, Dudley?" "Oh, tell her, of course," replied his friend. "I could not keep her in unnecessary suspense for a moment, for she will see the necessity of her acting differently towards others." A slight smile came upon the lip of Captain M as he heard their conversation. "I do not know whether you are aware," he said, "but there are a good many guests at Brandon, reputed suitors of the young lady. Indeed, it is more like the hall of Ulysses during his absence than anything else. But I suppose," he continued, with a gay glance towards Dudley, "the wandering king of Ithaca will some day soon return to claim his own, and drive these daring mortals from the gates." His words did not cheer Dudley, for there were still too many difficulties in his path, too many painful circumstances in his situation, for anything like gay hope to brighten the cloudy aspect of his fate; and as he did not himself reply, Edgar reverted to what they had been speaking of before, and said, "Well, I will ride on then at once, and I suppose I shall hear from you as to farther proceedings." "Oh yes, I shall easily find a messenger," replied Dudley; and once more shaking hands warmly with Captain M, he saw him and his companion depart. Little delay was made upon the road by Captain M and Edgar Adelon, although the latter had a strong inclination to choose the right-hand road, where it parted from the highway to Barhampton, leading direct to Clive Grange. He refrained, however, remembering that his father must know of the wreck, and might hear that he was on board. On arriving at Brandon House, the tranquil aspect of all things, and the servant's reply that Sir Arthur was playing at piquet, showed him that no great anxiety on his account had found its way into his father's bosom, and consequently proceeding to the library himself, he requested Captain M to send Eda to him, as we have seen he did. The moment she appeared, he took her in his arms and kissed her with fraternal affection, saying, "I have just escaped death, dearest Eda, and I wanted to see you before I see any one else, for I have good news for you. Dudley is well, is here in England, and has received a full pardon." Eda turned very pale, pressed her hand upon her heart, and grasped the arm of a chair for support. "Stay, stay, Edgar," she said; "do not tell me too much at once. A full pardon, do you say? But still the stain will remain upon his name." Edgar drew back a step and gazed at her gravely, almost sternly. "And would that make any difference to you, Eda, when you knew him, when you felt him to be innocent?" he demanded. Eda waved her hand with a look of reproach. "None, Edgar, none," she answered. "You cannot suppose such a thing for a moment. But it will make a great difference to him. I know Dudley well, and I feel sure that these things will cast a shadow over his whole life if his innocence cannot be clearly established. But yet I will not regret it," she cried, rising with a brighter look, and laying her hand upon her cousin's arm. "It will give me the means, dear Edgar, of proving to him what devotion and attachment a woman's heart is capable of. The vision of my young love, when first he and I knew each other, now 8 years ago, will now indeed be realized. I thought then how happy it would make me to show such a man as that no circumstances of fortune, no inducements, no unworthy obstacles could affect in the slightest degree my attachment when once given upon just and reasonable grounds. Now I can prove it to him all, and I am ready to prove it." "I am sorry, dear girl, to dispel your visions of devotion," answered Edgar gaily; "but here, though you can make him as happy as man need be, by giving him your fair hand and your true heart, you cannot cheer him under the doubt and suspicion of the world, for from that he is now quite cleared. His pardon was not granted till his innocence was proved beyond a doubt, by the acknowledgment of him who did the deed for which he has been so great a sufferer; and be assured that he will not rest satisfied until, by act of Parliament, his condemnation is reversed. I will tell you more hereafter, dear cousin, and now I will go and see if I can find fitter clothes to appear in this smart house. for during the last year and a half I have been much more accustomed to sit in ships' cabins, or to range wild woods, than to take my place in a gay drawing-room. But remember, Eda, not one word of Dudley's return, nor of his pardon. There is much to be done and thought of." Eda would fain have had some explanations regarding the wreck of the vessel which brought her cousin over, but Edgar answered gaily, "I will tell all that to the assembled multitude in the drawing-room;" and then he, in turn, asked questions about Clive Grange and its inhabitants. But Eda replied in the same tone in which he had spoken, "I will tell you all that to morrow, Edgar. You cannot see Helen to night, nor indeed to morrow either, for she and Mr. Clive are both absent, I find, and do not return till the end of the week." With that they parted. CHAPTER 38 of The Convict, by G.P.R. James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. About an hour and a half after Edgar had left him, Dudley was seated with Martin Oldkirk at a very homely meal; but it was good, though plain, and the gentleman had shared, or rather more than shared, with his companion the small portion of brandy which the labouring man had brought. Either Dudley's spirits had risen, or he had assumed a greater degree of cheerfulness than he really felt. He was by nature frank and free, as the good old English term goes, although early misfortunes had, as we have shown in his room at Cambridge, given a thoughtful cast to an imaginative mind. If, occasionally, he seemed a little proud or haughty, it was with his equals or his superiors in rank, where a feeling that impaired circumstances in himself might generate a sense of condescension in them, induced him, by a certain coldness of manner, to repel that vainest form of pride. With those inferior to him his manner was very different. Calm, easy, certain of his own position and of their estimation of it, he ran no chance of offending by too great familiarity, or for checking by too great reserve. He was well aware that the lower classes are much keener observers than the general world gives them credit for being, and that their estimation of their superiors in station is generally founded on much more just grounds than those on which men who are accustomed to judge by mere conventional standards too frequently rely. Oldkirk had become easy in his society, and their conversation, though not perhaps exactly gay, was cheerful and interesting. Dudley described the house that Norries had built for himself, his habits, his manners of life, the difficulties, the dangers, the pleasures, and the wild freedom of an Australian settler; and Martin Oldkirk questioned and talked and discussed as if his companion had been an old friend. They put their feet to the fire, they gazed into the glowing embers, they leaned on either side of the table in meditative chat, and the high-born, high-bred gentleman felt that he was speaking with a man of considerable natural powers, who, though uncultivated, was not ignorant, and though not always courteous, rarely actually vulgar. At length Dudley drew out his pocket-book, and taking forth the memoranda which he had previously examined, looked over them for a moment, and then inquired, in an ordinary tone, "Pray, did you ever know a person of the name of Filmer, Peter Filmer?" The man started from his seat as if he had been struck. His whole countenance worked, his lips quivered, his brow contracted, and his sharp eyes fixed upon Dudley with a fierce and angry stare. It seemed as if he were deprived of the power of utterance, for though his under jaw moved, as if he would have spoken, he spoke not, but struck the table a hard blow with his clenched fist. "What is the matter?" exclaimed Dudley. "I did not intend to agitate you in this manner. I had no idea that such simple words could produce such emotion." Martin Oldkirk cast himself down again upon the settle from which he had risen, pressing his hands upon his eyes; and when Dudley added a few words more, he exclaimed in a loud, harsh voice, "Hold your tongue! Hold your tongue! You have named a fiend, and you have raised one." "I did not intend it, I assure you," replied Dudley. "Let us speak of something else." "No!" cried the man. "I can neither speak nor think of anything else now that name is mentioned. Let me look at that paper. Let me see what is put down there." "I have no objection," answered Dudley; "but if it is to agitate you thus, you had really a great deal better forbear." The man did not answer, but stretched forth his hand, and Dudley gave him the paper. He then laid it down before him, drew the single candle closer to him, and supporting his broad forehead with his clasped hands, and leaning his elbows on the board, gazed upon the memoranda with a haggard and staring eye. He remained in the same position for fully 10 minutes, without uttering one word, and then, pushing the paper across to Dudley, he said, in a much calmer tone, "That is Mr. Norries's writing?" "It is," answered Dudley; "but I am quite sure he had no intention the questions he had there put down for me to ask would agitate you so terribly." "He should have known, he should have known," said Martin Oldkirk, with stern bitterness. "But it matters not. I shall have recovered myself before to morrow morning, and we will then talk more. But yet, tell me first, what have you to do with this man, this but it seemed he could not utter the word, and after breaking off the sentence abruptly, he added, "Have you ever seen him? Do you know him?" "I have seen him, do know him," answered Dudley, "and I have every reason to believe that he has endeavoured to injure me most basely." Dudley paused and thought for a moment or two, and then added, "I had better, perhaps, tell you how, for you had some share in the business." "I? I?" exclaimed Martin Oldkirk. "What had I to do between you and him? I have not seen him for many long years. I knew Sir Arthur Adelon was here, it is true, and I kept out of his way; but the priest is not with him, surely?" "The priest is with him," answered Dudley, "and has never left him." "Oh, yes, he did, yes, he did," replied the peasant. "He was away 2 whole years, I know. I thought he had gone to do penance, as he would call it, and would never appear in the world again. Had he done so, had he wept in solitude and silence for the whole of his bad career, I might have forgotten it. No, not forgotten it. Forgiven, perhaps, but forgot it, never. He is here, then, here in this country, here in the baronet's house?" "I cannot exactly say that," answered Dudley, "for I do not know, and I would not deceive you on any account; but he was here 2 years ago, rather more, perhaps, for it was in the autumn, and he did all he could to injure me, though life or death were at stake." "Ay, that is strange," said Martin Oldkirk. "Pray, may I ask what is your name, sir? For that is a thing I do not know even yet." "My name is Dudley," replied his companion; "and you may perhaps remember—" "Why, then, you are the man who was tried and cast for the death of the young lord over the cliffs?" said Martin Oldkirk, interrupting him. "The same," answered Dudley. "I was tried and condemned for an act with which I had nothing to do. Of Father Filmer I have seen little or nothing, except when he came to visit me in prison, and tried to convert me to the Roman Catholic faith." "Ah, he never lost sight of that," answered Oldkirk; "but still, what had he to do with you?" "Why, you shall hear," answered Dudley; "only let me tell my tale to the conclusion. Do you remember one night when Mr. Adelon came to visit you, and when you gave him a good deal of assistance?" "Oh, yes, I remember it very well," answered the man. "I thought at first there was some trick, and I would not say much, but I soon got sure of my man, and then I was willing enough to do anything I could for him; for I thought of his mother, poor young man. It's a pity I couldn't do more, but I fancied that Mr. Norries would know how to manage." "Mr. Norries knew little of the matter till it all transpired long afterwards," replied Dudley; "but now, as a friend, Mr. Norries wishes me to possess such information as to frustrate the schemes of this Mr. Filmer, and he knows no one better to whom he could send me than yourself." "I should like to see the letter," said Martin Oldkirk. "I am afraid that cannot well be," replied Mr. Dudley. "My baggage, as I told you, is by this time doubtless at the bottom of the sea. But you know Mr. Norris's handwriting, and you cannot doubt that those memoranda were put down by him." "That's true, that's true. But still I should like to see the letter. However, don't let us talk any more of the things which are so long gone. I will give you an answer to-morrow, when I have thought over it. In the meantime, I should like very much to hear what the matter was all about 2 years ago. I recollect the trial very well, and Mr. Adelon coming to me in search of information. I gave him a rudish sort of answer at first, but he was so frank and so desperate-like that I could not well refuse him, and in the end I went with him to Norris, but I cannot see how this hypocritical priest had anything to do with that." "What object and interest he could have, I know not," answered Dudley, who was a little puzzled with the rambling and desultory manner in which his companion spoke. "All I can tell you is what he actually did, and of that Mr. Adelon says he has no doubt. In the first place, when Edgar went to meet you the second time, he saw you at the old workhouse of a place the name of which I forget. He was followed secretly, by Mr. Filmer's order, by a little boy, who was directed, immediately he discovered the place he entered, to give information to the constable of the 100, who was already warned to seize Mr. Adelon, and any one whom he had with him, on the pretence of his companions having been engaged in the Chartist riots." "Ay, I broke my master constable's head for his pains," said Oldkirk. "Go on, sir." "He then deceived Mr. Adelon as to the time of my trial," continued Dudley, "and subsequently the same man gave intimation to a blacksmith, named Edward Lane, who could have borne important testimony, that the officers of justice were seeking for him. This priest also persuaded Mr. Clive and his daughter, who could have proved my innocence at once, and who have proved it since, to fly from England, and induced a man, named Daniel Connor, to give evidence which approached as near perjury as possible." "He hated you heartily," said Martin Oldkirk, setting his teeth hard, "and he cannot hate without seeking to destroy." "For some reason he certainly does seem to hate me," replied Dudley, "and whether he has power to injure me further or not, I cannot tell. But at all events, it is the opinion of both Mr. Adelon and myself that he will try to do so, and that, perhaps, in matters which most deeply affect my welfare. Mr. Norris, with whom I consulted, told me to ask you for some particulars of this priest's previous life, which he thought would open the eyes of Sir Arthur Adelon to the man's real character." "Puppies are only blind 9 days," replied Oldkirk, with a bitter smile. "Sir Arthur Adelon has been blind for 20 years. You will find it a hard matter to open his eyes. Did his son tell him what the priest had done in your case?" "No," answered Dudley, "he did not, on many accounts. For some weeks after my condemnation Edgar was very ill, and then he only arrived at the whole truth by degrees. He proposes now to do so, however, and I wish to strengthen the case against this man by any previous circumstances which may tend to show his false and deceitful character." "Do not tell it to Sir Arthur Adelon when alone," said Oldkirk, musing while he spoke. "He is too weak to retain a deep impression long. He may believe a part of what you say at first, but his inclination will be not to believe, and if his own better judgment and convictions are not backed up by those of others, they will soon fall and be forgotten. I have seen it so myself. As to the rest, I will think over it, sir, and see what can be done. It is many a year since I heard that bitter name, and it has raised feelings in me which I had hoped and thought were dead. I will try to get quieter before to-morrow. I did not know the viper was so near me, or I might have tried to crush his brains out before now. I knew that Sir Arthur was here a great deal, but him I have never seen but once, and that at a distance. The son I saw many times, for he rode much about the country, and I used to think how much like his poor mother he was; but I never spoke to him till he came that night to see me, for I did not wish to have anything more to do with them." "Did no one ever tell you that they had a priest with them?" asked Dudley. "Oh yes, I heard that," replied Martin Oldkirk; "but there are many priests in Rome, and I knew that this man had been away for a long while after poor Lady Adelon's death, so I never thought it was the same. Did Mr. Norris tell you to ask me for anything more?" "Yes," replied Dudley. "He said you have charge of certain papers belonging to me." "They were given me by Norris," replied Oldkirk, "and I certainly shan't give them to any one without his orders." "Perhaps you are right," replied Dudley; "and to tell you the truth, I care very little about them, for they only serve to prove a fact which I have long known, that strong passions take as inveterate a hold of weak minds as of more powerful minds. They might, indeed, give me some little authority and influence where it may be needful, but that is all." "Strike at Filmer! Strike at Filmer!" said Martin Oldkirk sharply; "and be you sure, sir, that man has nourished in the baronet every evil plant till it has produced evil fruit. But remember, whatever you do, do it before plenty of witnesses. Take some public room, some crowd, some general meeting, and tax him there with all his wickedness. Unmask him before multitudes, and make him a scoff and a byword for ever. But now, sir, it is late. You must be tired enough, and we shall have many things to talk of to morrow. It is my way, when anything moves me a great deal, to lie down and sleep. I sleep like a stone when I am much moved, and then I get up with my thoughts fresh and clear. I have made you up the best bed I can, and I dare say weariness will be as good as a feather pillow. Wait, I will light you another candle. I dare say, now, you never sat with a single one before." "I have sat through long nights with none," replied Dudley. "You forget, my good friend, what it is to be a convict in a penal colony, and cannot know what it is to be an escaped convict, in the midst of wilds and deserts which the foot of man has seldom trod. But such has been my fate." "I did forget," replied Martin Oldkirk. "You have had a hard lot, sir." And Dudley and he parted for the night. The sun had been up more than an hour when Dudley awoke, on the following morning, and while he dressed himself in the little back room of the cottage where he had slept, he heard voices in the neighbouring chamber, and could distinguish the words, "I hope the gentleman will remember us well for our trouble, for you see, Martin, the locks aren't broken, and we've not even looked into them." "I will be answerable for him," replied the voice of Martin Oldkirk. "You may be sure he will pay you well." And the words were succeeded by a heavy trailing sound, as if some large object was dragged slowly from one side of the room to another. When Dudley entered the front chamber, he saw two large boxes standing on the left-hand side, to which Martin Oldkirk pointed with a look of satisfaction, saying, "We've got them out, sir, though we had some trouble, and they seemed pretty well soaked in the sea-water. Now that the tide's out, she stands well nigh high and dry at one part. That's to say, what's left of her, for the masts are all down, and she's broken in two. Another tide, if the wind goes on blowing in this way, won't leave a stick of her together. A good deal has been got out of her notwithstanding. 1/3 of the cargo, I dare say, and most of the passengers' baggage." "This is indeed an important service, Oldkirk," replied Dudley, "and you shall now have Norris's letter. But we must break the chest open, for my keys are lost." What he proposed was soon effected. The trunks were broken open, the different articles they contained taken out to dry, and the letter which had been so often mentioned was placed in Oldkirk's hands. He took it to the window and read it eagerly, and then exclaimed, "That's a good man! That's a good man, sir! He's the only lawyer that I ever knew who would come forward to help a poor man without fee or reward. He's saved me from ruin. The little I have I owe all to him, and I will do all that he tells me. You shall hear all about it, sir, every word. But first let us have some breakfast." CHAPTer 38. Chapter 39 of The Convict, by G.P.R. James. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. The calm evening light was shining sweetly upon park and wood and valley, and high bare down. A strong wind blew the fleecy clouds fast across the sky, burying the face of earth with shadows that chased one another like children in their play. And ever and anon the sun was left clear and brilliant, and his rays, poured obliquely from a point hardly 2 hands' breadth from the horizon, gilded the western sides of the trees, and made their lustrous leaves shine like diamonds. Through the heart of Eda Brandon the shadowy clouds of manifold emotions passed as rapidly as the vapours over the sky, but still the sun of hope shone forth again, and rendered the little world of her fair bosom as bright and sparkling as the scene around her. He was safe, he was home again, he was near her, he was clear of blame. His innocence was made manifest to the eyes of the whole world. She could look with pride even to his sufferings and to her own love. She could say, "He has been injured, traduced, and grieved, but he is innocent, and I have loved him still." Oh, how joyful was the thought of consoling him through life for all he had undergone! How sweet the expectation of seeing him again, as, leaning on Edgar's arm, she walked quickly across the park towards the old priory. But yet those feelings were sorely agitating. Joy would hold its place, and all seem glad and cheerful for a time; but then the very intensity of her affection would reach a point which became almost painful, and a sensation of faintness would come over her, and make her pause and pant for breath. Edgar felt for her, for although a great change had come over him since first he was presented to the reader, although experience and action, the seasoning fires of youth, had given decision and firmness to his character, although he had grown more powerful in mind, more manly in character, yet not one of the warm enthusiastic feelings of his heart had been lost, and he could understand what it is to feel, with sensations very like those of fear, the meeting with a lover under such circumstances as hers. He soothed her kindly and tenderly too. He cheered her with every bright subject that fancy could suggest; but he ventured not to laugh or jest as he might have done at another time, for he saw and knew that the emotions were too deep, the waters of the heart too profound, to be stirred by the light winds in sport. At length the limits of the park were reached, and they passed out. He walked quickly through the little wood, though Eda murmured, "Oh, Edgar!" and would fain have paused for a moment, for he thought she would be better, stronger, happier, when the first meeting was over. In a minute more, the grey ruin, and the green ivy, and the little meadow before the sculptured porch, and the stream glancing beyond, were before their eyes, and the form of Dudley, rising up from a pile of architectural fragments on which he had been sitting, was in Eda's sight. There had been many emotions, as I have said, in her breast as she walked thither. There had been anxiety, and joy, and some degree of apprehension of she knew not what; but the moment that she beheld him, every impression gave way to one, the thought of all he had suffered, and how he had suffered it. It came rushing upon her like a torrent, as one great image, the anguish, the indignation, the privations, the sorrows, the wrongs he had endured and felt; and giving way at once to the impulse of the heart, and forgetting all conventional forms, and the cold, thoughtful ceremonies of the world, she sprang forward, she cast herself into his arms, she wept with mingled joy and grief. There was a long, long pause, for neither of the two could speak, and Edgar would not. The tears rose, too, in Dudley's eyes, not the tears of those weaker emotions which shape the light and the tender on meeting again with those they love, but the tears of strong, powerful, soul-subduing gratitude to God for mercies shown, and hope and happiness restored. He thanked from his very heart the Almighty Ruler of all destinies that he had seen his native land again. He thanked him for deliverance from disgrace, and sorrow, and undeserved punishment. He thanked him for the reputation cleared, a high name restored, for honour, and for peace, and for dawning happiness, and perhaps he thanked him more than all for giving him the love, the persevering, devoted, unchanging love of one whom he loved so well. It was indeed the crowning blessing of all, that which alone could render life cheerful and pleasant to him, and while, with his arms around her, he pressed her to his heart, and kissed her soft cheek, he felt that of all the blessings prepared for man by the great Creator in the terrestrial paradise, there was no blessing equal to the last, which was bestowed for the comfort and consolation needed by man even in Eden. At length their feelings found voice, and seating themselves upon the same shaded pile of chiselled stonework where Dudley had waited the coming of Eda and her cousin, they began to talk over the past and the future. Of the past the reader knows so much that he need not listen to their conversation here, nor did Dudley dwell upon it long, for he knew that their time was short, and that Eda must speedily return to mingle once more with gay scenes, in which she took no interested part. But turning quickly to the more important present, on which so much depended, he besought Eda not to say to any one that she had seen him, nor to give a hint that he had returned to the land. "There are many things, dearest Eda," he said, "which I wish to do before I openly avow myself. I must, in the first place, claim back my property from the crown, and take measures to make my restitution to all my rights, and the restoration of honour to my name, as clear and perfect as possible. And for these purposes I must see Mr. Clive, but I am told he is absent. Do you think he will soon return?" "Not till the end of the week, they told me at the Grange, Dudley," answered Miss Brandon; "but I can easily get his address." "Are you quite sure, dear Eda," asked Dudley, "that he has not told the facts concerning the death of Lord Hadley to other and less discreet persons than yourself, especially to Mr. Filmer?" "Certainly not, unless by letter," replied Eda, "for both Mr. Clive and Helen were away when we arrived. I have asked at many of the cottages of the peasantry in regard to the cause of his long absence, but do not find that any one entertains the slightest suspicion of what it seems, from Edgar's account, has taken place in London, and I am quite sure that neither my uncle nor Mr. Filmer have the slightest knowledge of the changed circumstances in which we stand. I think it might be better," she added, and then paused and hesitated, with a beautiful blush rising up and tinging her cheek and temples, "I think it might be better, why should I scruple to say so, to come up to Brandon and claim me for your own at once. There are several persons there, some of them entertaining expectations, I believe with my uncle's encouragement, which can never be fulfilled; and I would fain have it known at once, Dudley, that my hand is promised to another, and that there is nothing which has been able to shake my esteem for a man whose conduct in trifles only gave me, in early years, the clearest indication of what would be his conduct in more important, though more painful scenes at an after period." Dudley pressed his lips upon her hand. "Dear Eda," he said, "the temptation is a great one, but let us think well what we are doing. Your uncle, I believe, knows not, has in fact no suspicion, that my innocence is proved and my pardon granted." "None whatever," answered Eda. "During several months, while we were wandering hither and thither, he only saw the newspapers at intervals, and I know not whether the case was ever stated in them at all." "It was hinted at in one of the evening prints," said Edgar Adelon; "but the whole transaction was conducted privately, without any affectation of secrecy indeed, but in a quiet unostentatious manner; and the Secretary of State thought, when all was decided, that it would be better to take no public notice of the transaction till your return, Dudley, when, as he said, you could yourself have recourse to such means as you might judge advisable." Dudley had fallen into a reverie while Edgar was speaking, but he roused himself immediately, saying, in the same low tone which they had hitherto employed, for the impression of their secret meeting affected even their conversation, while no one could hear, "Perhaps it might be better, as you say, Eda; but if I determine upon following this course, prepare yourself, love, for somewhat strange and perhaps unpleasant scenes. Your uncle will, of course, imagine at first that I am an escaped convict. He will be indignant at my showing myself at his house at all, still more indignant at what he will consider my rash pretensions. He may carry this indignation to violent measures and harsh terms, and if you yourself are present, it may place you in unpleasant circumstances." "I fear not," answered Eda. "The whole will be easily explained; and although he will, doubtless, still object, and I might be most unwilling, in matters not affecting my whole happiness and welfare, to reject the counsel of one who has been a father to me. Yet in this case, Dudley, no objections will be of any avail. I have scrutinized my own heart. I know and understand my own feelings, and I am ready to choose my part at once, and to act up to it to the end." "But the question is this," said Dudley: "can you do so, my Eda, if I think fit, on motives of my own, to give no explanation to your uncle, or to any one who may be present, to let mistakes go on, and confusion work itself clear by gradual and natural means?" "But upon what motives, Dudley?" asked Eda, in a tone of anxiety. "Why should you suffer mistakes to exist, when there is an easy way of explaining them?" "Not for the purpose, believe me, dear girl," replied Dudley, "of showing how strong is the force of your attachment, and inducing you to avow your unshaken affection even for a condemned convict; neither with a view to let your uncle commit himself by injustice towards me, but to open his eyes, perhaps, to the conduct of a villain and a hypocrite who has long deceived him. The course I propose seems to me to be the best adapted to that object. But I will think over it, Eda, till to morrow morning. Could not you and Edgar stroll down here together, on an early walk, an hour or two before breakfast?" "Assuredly," answered Edgar, speaking for his cousin. "All our guests are sad lie beds, and will be in no condition to interrupt us, except our good friend Captain M , and of him we can easily dispose." "Well, I will think of it to night," replied Dudley. "I should have liked to see Clive first, indeed; but I think, as he is absent, we must not wait his coming. Only remember not to give any explanation till I judge right to do so myself. I think Eda will not disavow her love under any circumstances." "Assuredly," answered Eda; "but one of our servants said to day that there was some expectation entertained of the return of Mr. Clive and Helen to morrow, tidings which have kept Edgar's heart beating all the day;" and she gazed at her cousin with a gay smile. "I shall be able to tell you more when we meet, Dudley," said Edgar; "and, to say the truth, I think your plan the very best you could have formed; for whether Mr. Clive is here or not, I shall be able to prove all the facts, having a copy of the depositions." "There are more facts than you know, Edgar," answered Dudley, in a somewhat stern tone; and Eda started at the words, and drew a little aside, saying, "Speak with me for a moment, Dudley. You would not, I am sure," she continued in a low voice, "do anything to injure my uncle. You may have obtained those papers of which we once heard much mention, but I think, nay, I am sure, that you would not use them to his detriment." "Pain him I must, Eda," replied Dudley. "Injure him I will not in the least degree, and even the pain shall turn to his benefit, ay, and to his peace, for with all his prosperity he has not been a happy man. But the sun is down, dear one, and I must not keep you longer, for it will be quite dark ere you reach the house." Thus saying, he led her back to where Edgar stood, and bade them adieu, adding, as they parted, in a louder tone than he had hitherto used, "Then I shall see you here to morrow about 8, and we will decide upon our future course." Edgar and Eda assured him they would not fail, and took their way back through the little wood. Dudley gazed after them till they were hidden by the young green boughs, and then walked slowly away in the direction of the small place called Beech Rock. For some minutes after he was gone, all was still and silent. The rosy beams of the evening departed from the light clouds overhead. The nightingale broke forth in the wood. The scene around lost its lustre, and became grey, and the bat, more surely summer's harbinger than even the martin, flitted quietly over the space before the old building, in search of its insect prey. At the end of those few minutes, however, some of the branches of ivy, which had extended themselves across the ruined doorway, were pushed back, and a dark shadowy figure came out in the grey twilight, and stood for a moment with the arms crossed upon the chest. It was that of a man, dressed in a long straight cut black coat, with a white cravat tied round the throat. There was nothing else remarkable in his appearance, and he gazed quietly to the left upon the road taken by Eda and Edgar, and then to the right, where Dudley had disappeared. He next fell into a fit of meditation, the nature of which it would be difficult to divine. It ended, however, with a low, unpleasant laugh, and saying to himself, "So, at 8 o'clock to morrow," he turned and walked away in the same direction as Miss Brandon and her cousin, but took the road under the park wall for some way, and entered the enclosure by a stile farther up. CHAPTER 39.